Welcome back to Crime Scene 24/7. To our returning subscribers, thank you for always engaging. Your likes, comments, and shares keeps us motivated. And if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our chilling crime scenes here. We dig deep, we investigate hard, and we bring you stories the mainstream left unsaid. So encourage us by engaging in our videos. Subscribe if you haven't, like, comment, and share. And what the investigation uncovered about a boy's darkest hour changed everything. Crime Scene 24/7. Invite you now into the story of Cristian Fernandez, a 12-year-old from Jacksonville, Florida, whose life and the death of his 2-year-old half-brother would become one of the most wrenching, debated criminal cases in the state's history. Cristian was born in 1999 in Miami, to a mother just 12 years old, Bianella Susana, and a father who was later convicted of sexually assaulting her. From his earliest moments, his life was marked by neglect. At age 2, he was found naked and dirty, wandering on a South Florida street while his grandmother, meant to care for him, was in a nearby motel using cocaine. By age 8, the state's child welfare agency had been alerted. He had allegedly been sexually molested by an older cousin, and school officials and counselors noted other troubling behavior. His stepfather physically abused him. One beating left his eye damaged. X-rays revealed old fractures in his ribs. The stepfather later died by suicide while police were en route to arrest him. On March 14, 2011, while Cristian was still 12 and in 6th grade, his 2-year-old half-brother, David Galarraga, was found unconscious in the apartment they shared. David was taken to hospital and died 2 days later from head injuries, a fractured skull, bruising around his left eye, and bleeding in the brain. Law enforcement investigators concluded the injuries had been inflicted, not accidental. The mother, Bianella Susana, waited some 8 hours before taking David to the hospital, according to reports. Investigators charged Cristian as an adult with first-degree murder in the death of David, making him the youngest person ever charged as an adult with murder in Duval County. Alongside that, another charge emerged after his 5-year-old half-brother disclosed sexual abuse allegations toward Cristian. Throughout the interrogation, lawyers would later argue that Cristian lacked the capacity to truly understand his rights, to waive them knowingly since he was only 12. The admissibility of his statements became a major legal battleground. Faced with mounting public attention and legal pressure, in February 2013, Cristian entered a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and aggravated battery rather than proceed to adult murder trial. The agreement stipulated treatment as a juvenile, confinement until his 19th birthday, followed by probation. While incarcerated at Cypress Creek Juvenile Offender Correctional Center in Lecanto, Florida, Cristian found an unlikely ally in Mary Cox, the wife of a prominent attorney, who became his court-appointed guardian ad litem and visited him every Saturday, driving more than 130 miles to sit with him, talk sports, books, dreams, and fears. Her hope to salvage something of the boy lost in the trauma. On January 15, 2018, one day after his 19th birthday, Cristian was released from the juvenile facility and began serving up to 8 years of probation under strict conditions: residence, employment, no unsupervised contact with minors. Tonight, as we unfold the tape-recorded interrogations, letters, social service records, psychological assessments, and courtroom hearings, we ask, was this tragedy avoidable? What echoes of past abuse awakened in that apartment that March night? How does the criminal justice system weigh a 12-year-old's culpability against the weight of his childhood? The answer will not come easily. The tears shed over David's death, over Cristian's broken childhood, over the system's failure, those are real. Stay with me as we walk every corridor of this case. The wreckage, the reckonings, the fragile possibility of redemption. In the weeks that followed the March 14, 2011 incident, investigators painstakingly reconstructed the events that led to the death of his 2-year-old half-brother, David Galarraga, and the subsequent turmoil that would define his life. The local medical examiner determined that David had suffered a fractured skull, bruising around his left eye and bleeding in his brain, injuries inconsistent with typical toddler play. Meanwhile, as the case against Cristian Fernandez unfolded, forensic psychologists noted that he denied any planning or intent to kill. One therapist's notes recorded that Cristian told them of having flashbacks of abuse by his stepfather, the very thing that triggered his violent behavior. The file described Cristian as emotionally detached when recounting the incident, stating simply that something had happened. On September 17, 2012, media outlets reported that Cristian, then 13 and facing adult charges in the state of Florida, would see his case heard by Judge Mallory Cooper on September 28, 2012. At that hearing, the judge ruled that Cristian's videotaped statements during his interrogation were inadmissible, on the grounds that he did not understand his rights when waiving them, including his right to remain silent and his right to counsel. As the wheels of justice turned, questions of treatment and punishment collided. The then state attorney, Angela Corey, chose to prosecute Cristian as an adult, a move that sparked fierce debate over the fairness of the system when the defendant is a child. Defenders pointed to the fact that children's brains are still developing, that trauma had shaped Cristian's world long before his 12th birthday, and that a sentence meant for an adult may not fit someone so young. In February 2013, after more than a year of court activity, Cristian entered a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges of manslaughter and aggravated battery rather than proceed to adult trial on the first-degree murder count. His sentence placed him in the juvenile system to remain locked in a juvenile facility until his 19th birthday. Behind those legal moves, one of the most unexpected relationships took root. Court-appointed as his guardian ad litem, former attorney and children's advocate Mary Cox began visiting Cristian every Saturday at the facility, making the 132-mile round trip from Jacksonville to Lecanto. She brought board games and art supplies, held his hand, spoke hope into his life. In her words, "I tell him I love him no matter what." Her presence exposed a sobering truth. While Cristian was punished, few were anticipating how to heal the wound beneath. Counseling and education were offered at his facility, but the question remained, was that enough? As January 15, 2018 arrived, the day after his 19th birthday, Cristian walked free from the Juvenile Correctional Facility. Under the terms of his release, he began serving up to 8 years of probation with conditions: to live in approved housing, maintain employment or schooling, continue therapy, and avoid unsupervised contact with minors. Now, years on, this case continues to ripple across juvenile justice reform discussions. Experts studying youth incarceration say his story underscores the long-term implications of locking up young defendants: lower educational attainment, increased health risks, greater likelihood of reoffending. Now, as we turn the tape over to you, the viewer, we ask, in this story of a boy made for once to carry every burden, all of his own, his siblings, the system's, did the punishment match the person? Did the system help or simply hold him until he matured? And what about the toddler who lay in the hospital, the mother who delayed care, the siblings whose lives were altered forever? Stay with us, because the answers are still unfolding. In the months following the plea agreement in February 2013, the environment around Cristian Fernandez shifted from courtroom drama to the slow arc of confinement and reflection. By mid-2013, he had been transferred into the secure confines of the Cypress Creek Juvenile Offender Correctional Center in Lecanto, where day-to-day life became a litany of monitored routines: school in the morning, therapy sessions in the afternoon, and lockdown at night. During these years, while the world outside debated the case, Cristian made small but meaningful movements. He worked toward completing his high school requirements behind bars, picked up art supplies as a form of expression, and under the watch of his guardian ad litem, Mary Cox, began to confront parts of his past he'd long buried. Still, his age and circumstances created a persistent tension. Having been only 12 when charged, the world he was living in, juvenile prison, meant he missed out on milestones others his age experienced: hanging out with friends, first jobs, even the freedom to see the stars at night. Mary Cox later said that during a regular visit, she realized Cristian hadn't seen the night sky in years, a stark image of how far removed his life had become from what most teens know. At the same time, the legal aftermath continued to cast its long shadow. In 2018, when Cristian turned 19 and was released from the juvenile facility on January 15th, his transition into the community began under strict probationary conditions, securing housing, obtaining employment or continuing education, maintaining contact with mental health services, and avoiding unsupervised contact with minors. Experts tracking the case noted that Cristian's release did not simply mark the end of an incarceration term. It marked the start of a more fragile phase. Research into youthful offenders shows that long stays in correctional facilities during formative years often correlate with reduced educational achievement, diminished job prospects, and higher risks of reoffending. His journey, they argued, would depend heavily on the supports in place now he was free. In those initial days of freedom, Cristian reportedly felt both relief and pressure. Relief at leaving the secure perimeter of juvenile detention, and pressure because every step forward would now be visible, every misstep consequential. The community around him, from former attorneys to social services professionals, acknowledged the task ahead, helping a boy who had become a symbol of our system's toughest questions to instead become a person capable of moving beyond that symbol. And so one question lingered. When the bars were behind him, the courtroom no longer his world, how would Cristian begin to stitch together the pieces of life that had been torn away by trauma, by circumstance, by the case itself? The weeks after his release on January 15, 2018 marked the beginning of a precarious new chapter for Cristian Fernandez. Now 19, stepping cautiously into a world that had never really been his. He emerged from the juvenile system weighed down not only by what he had done, but by what had been done to him. He exited the gates of the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice facility and entered probation, under conditions that reminded him every day that his freedom was conditional and fragile. He returned to society with obligations that a normal 19-year-old hardly contemplates: secure approved housing, maintain full-time employment or education, follow a rigid therapy schedule, and keep distance from minors unless supervised. The motion filed by his attorneys late in 2017 spoke of circumstances which render application of the conditions of probation unrealistic and problematic. Meanwhile, the public lens that had shone so brightly on the case remained unshaken. Fernandez's story, a child once charged as an adult, covered in headlines from the age of 12, did not vanish once his detention ended. Advocates noted the notoriety posed unique hurdles. From job applications to everyday interactions, the image of preteen killer followed him. Therapy and education continued to play central roles. While inside the facility, he had enrolled in school and taken part in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral interventions. But now, out in the community, the real challenge began: transitioning those programs into a life that demanded autonomy, accountability, and resilience. At the same time, the debate around juvenile justice, which his case ignited, did not end. Legal scholars cited Fernandez's path as evidence of how treating a 12-year-old like an adult defendant not only complicates the legal calculus but leaves a scar on rehabilitation efforts. And so the next question loomed. When the fences were gone, when the school dorm became a rented room, when the guarded routine dissolved into the everyday, could Cristian steer himself towards something beyond his past? Would the supports be enough? Would the world allow him a second chapter? The answer remains unwritten, but one thing is certain. For him, every step forward is a choice made amid echoes of trauma, expectation, and the hope of becoming someone not defined solely by what happened. In the months and years that followed his entry into the community, Cristian Fernandez faced a complex web of expectations, scrutiny, and possibility. Though he had left the juvenile facility on January 15, 2018, the day after his 19th birthday, his freedom was framed less as a fresh start than as a measured transition under the weight of what he'd been through and what was ahead. By mid-2018, records show his attorneys were already petitioning the court to amend some probation conditions, arguing that certain requirements imposed on him were unrealistic and problematic. It was as if the system, which once treated a 12-year-old as an adult defendant, was now struggling to treat a 19-year-old as a young man trying to rebuild. Community advocates who had watched his case noted that the stigma remained intense. The headlines that once screamed 12-year-old charged as adult did not evaporate simply because his confinement ended. For employers, neighbors, and probation officers, the former designation lingered. While the strict terms of his probation included residence restrictions, employment or education mandates, continued therapy, and close supervision, they also required that he avoid unsupervised contact with minors, a reminder that the past could not be divorced from his future. In therapy sessions, he continued to explore early traumas, the neglect, the abuse, the moments when he, while still a child, had tried to process survival by shutting down emotionally. Counselors described his challenge as twofold: live externally as a free young adult, while internally still managing the identity of child defendant that had followed him. By late 2018 and into 2019, his case had become a reference point in juvenile justice circles. Scholars use the Fernandez story to argue that incarcerating a child so young, as in this cold snapshot of 12 years old facing adult charges, can carry deep long-term implications for education, mental health outcomes, and recidivism. But amidst the media focus and systemic commentary, there remained the quieter, personal side of the story. A young man at 19 trying to carve a life when so many foundational years had been lost. Friends, volunteers, and advocates describe him as engaging in art, attempting normal relationships, and at times smiling in spite of what his young life had endured. And so, as the calendar turned, the question shifted subtly but profoundly. When one begins freedom under conditions, how much of one's life is still defined by the prison cell and the courtroom? How do you support someone whose childhood was fractured before it truly began? That question hangs over every step Cristian takes now. His is not simply a story of what happened, but of what happens next. And in that waiting, the stakes are real, the second chance is fragile, and the possibility of redemption not guaranteed yet quietly persistent. In the years since his release in January 2018, Cristian Fernandez has lived under a distinctive kind of freedom. One defined by supervision, expectation, and a community watching closely. Although he stepped out of a juvenile facility the day after his 19th birthday, his journey has not resembled that of a typical young adult. In the weeks following his return to society, a judge granted a temporary suspension of certain probation conditions, terms his attorneys described as unrealistic and problematic, as his transition began. Those conditions, maintaining employment or schooling, continuing intense therapy, abiding by strict housing requirements, avoiding unsupervised contact with minors, remained in place even as their enforcement was relaxed. Professionals tracking his case observe that Fernandez now carries multiple burdens: the stigma of headline-making youth crime, the challenge of finding a path blocked by past trauma, and the pressure of living under probation that stretches into his mid-20s if all goes well. In therapy, he continues to confront the child he once was, the boy born in Miami in 1999 to a 12-year-old mother, the one found naked and wandering at age 2, the one who endured abuse, neglect, and chaos long before he ever went into custody. As of now, his story remains incomplete. He is a young man walking in a world that expects accountability, while still carrying the weight of what happened when he was 12. The question now: can the structures around him support a transformation, or will the past define every step ahead? In the unfolding years after his release, the spotlight on Cristian Fernandez, now entering adulthood, shifted from the court case headlines to subtle, persistent questions about life after confinement. His probation, though officially begun in January 2018, carried terms that extended into his 20s and shaped nearly every decision he made. By early 2019, defense filings indicated that his attorneys were negotiating adjustments to the supervision requirements, acknowledging that the standard juvenile aftercare model did not neatly apply to someone who had been charged as an adult at age 12. Meanwhile, Fernandez continued to meet with his court-appointed guardian ad litem, Mary Cox, who had visited him weekly during his confinement. Her role shifted toward helping him map out what life might look like outside the facility: employment plans, housing stability, managing trauma symptoms, and rebuilding trust in relationships. The broader juvenile justice community kept Fernandez's case in view. not merely as a legal precedent, but as a human experiment in what happens after. On February 18, 2018, an analysis in the local paper noted that his story underscored how long the consequences last for children prosecuted as adults. Social services professionals caution that for someone like Fernandez, the institutional routine of detention offers structure, yet the world outside demands navigating ambiguity, freedom, setbacks, and self-management. They emphasized that the months after release are often the most vulnerable. In the quiet spaces of his life now, job applications, therapy sessions, community meetings, Fernandez faced the layered reality that his past trauma, the death of his half-brother David Galarraga in March 2011, and the public consequences of his case would not simply be over the moment he walked out the facility gates. The lines between young adult, ex-juvenile offender, former child defendant, and survivor of early abuse blurred constantly. And so the question evolved. When the cameras recede and the formal supervision winds its way toward conclusion, will the supports in his life, legal, therapeutic, relational, be enough to hold what had been broken? Will the young man once charged as an adult at age 12 find a place where he is seen, not as a case file, but as a human being with a future? His journey continues, not in court, but in the daily intimate work of healing, rebuilding, and redefining. In late 2019, nearly 2 years into his probation, Cristian Fernandez, now 20 years old, began engaging more actively with community-based programs aimed at young adults re-entering society under supervision. These initiatives helped him enroll in vocational training as a way to fulfill the employment requirement embedded in his probation. By early 2020, his court file shows that his probation officer flagged the need for a modified monitoring plan. The initial framework, designed for adult offenders, did not fully reflect the developmental status of a young man whose adolescence had largely been served in confinement. In private sessions, Fernandez continued to confront the lingering echoes of his childhood, the abuse and neglect he'd endured, the death of his half-brother David Galarraga in March 2011, and the crushing weight of being prosecuted at age 12. His therapist documented his efforts to manage anxiety, depression, and episodic trauma responses, a testament not just to his past, but to the magnitude of the healing journey ahead. While the public spotlight had dimmed, the stigma remained. Despite his young adult status, job applications still asked about felony convictions. Landlords scrutinized his past. Even in therapeutic settings, he was often referred to as that 12-year-old tried as an adult. Those labels, court observers warn, pose real obstacles to successful reintegration. In mid-2021, legal advocacy groups pointed to his case as a textbook example of systemic tensions. When the legal system treats a child as an adult offender, then transitions him into adult social systems, the gaps between punishment, rehabilitation, and youth development become sharply visible. His name continued to be cited in juvenile justice reform circles for precisely that reason. And so the question entered a new phase. As Cristian moves into his early 20s, the question is no longer only what happened or who he was, but who he will become. The probation phase remains active, the supports remain necessary, and the journey remains ongoing. As 2022 unfolded, Cristian Fernandez, now about 23 years old, continued navigating life with the lingering resonance of his adolescent trauma and the demands of his probation still in force. In the community, those close to him observed subtle changes. The young man who was arrested at 12 was now cautiously building routines, steady employment, therapy attendance, and checking in regularly with his probation officer. Though the headlines that once labeled him the 12-year-old tried as an adult had quieted, the identity they created remained part of his every step. Professionals working on youth justice reform pointed to Fernandez's case as a continuing example of how early exposure to violence and neglect shapes life beyond the walls of a juvenile facility. They noted that while his years of incarceration ended in January 2018, the process of healing and adaptation was far from complete. In private therapy, he began confronting the gulf between the time he lost and the time he had ahead. At 23, he was aware that many of his peers had finished high school, possibly gone to college or started families, while for him those years had been spent under correctional supervision. That awareness brought grief, but also a quiet determination to redefine his future. Meanwhile, community advocates who had visited him weekly while he served his term, such as Mary Cox, shifted roles from weekly visitor to mentor in his reintegration. They emphasized consistency, connection, and reframing purpose as essential in the years after release. Yet the odds remained stacked. Despite meeting probation conditions, the barriers to full reintegration were many. Employers wary of his past, social networks shaped by confinement, emotional scars from trauma sustained long before his incarceration. Experts flagged that having been charged as an adult at 12 carries a long shadow effect on identity and opportunities, and so the question remained. At 23, having left the facility years ago, under probation and cautious steps, could Cristian move beyond the identity of young offender and become simply a young man with a future? The answer, like his path, remained unfolding. In the spring of 2023, with his 24th birthday approaching, Cristian Fernandez found himself walking a delicate line between cautious hope and the echoes of his past. He had now spent more years in the community than behind bars, yet the deepest moments of his transformation remained unseen by the public. According to recent profiles, he had begun exploring higher education opportunities, enrolling in night classes aimed at vocational certification, something he had deferred for years while incarcerated. The probation conditions under which Fernandez lived continued to shape his every decision. While the intense restrictions of his early 19-year-old re-entry phase had eased somewhat, he still carried check-ins with a probation officer, mandatory therapy sessions for trauma and abuse, and the need to secure housing deemed acceptable under court standards. His guardian ad litem, Mary Cox, remained a consistent presence, now as mentor rather than weekly visitor, guiding him through employment hurdles and helping him navigate social systems that didn't always account for someone who grew up both as victim and defendant. At this juncture, Fernandez's identity was no longer just the boy charged at age 12, but a young man weaving a new narrative. Yet that identity shift carried its own friction. The public record and media headlines often refused to let him forget his role in the tragic death of his half-brother, David Galarraga, in March 2011. He was keenly aware that while others his age could pursue full freedom, he remained tethered until at least his probation term ended. Legal analysts noted this limbo is common for youth processed as adults. Release is one milestone, but full reintegration is often a much slower climb. Therapeutically, Fernandez continued piecing together the fractured parts of his childhood: the neglect, early sexual abuse allegations, physical violence, and the sense of invisibility he carried for years. His counselors described his biggest breakthroughs as small, allowing himself to feel anger, to grieve the loss of normal childhood years, and to accept ongoing support rather than find solace in isolation. Outside the therapy room, everyday challenges loomed: a former employer balking at his past, a landlord questioning his criminal history, social media posts reawakening the case's notoriety. Advocates say stigma often slows the path from released young offender to productive adult citizen. Fernandez's story was evolving in that gap, and so in 2023 the question remained not just whether he could build a new life, but how. Could the support structures, education, employment, therapy, and relational trust hold him steady as he outgrew the legacies of his past? For Cristian Fernandez, now in his mid-20s, the future was not pre-written, it was very much under construction. In early 2024, now 24 years old, Cristian Fernandez continued navigating the quiet complexities of his reintegrated life. After his release from the juvenile facility in January 2018, the years had shifted his world, from confinement into cautious freedom, but the journey remained far from simple. During this period, Fernandez began exploring creative outlets more seriously. Art, which he had used quietly behind the walls of the juvenile facility, became a mode of expression in the community. Sketches of memory, paintings of emotion, fragments of a life reconstructed. Those who know him say art became less of a hobby, more of a lifeline. Simultaneously, his legal supervision was reaching a pivotal juncture. The probation terms that followed his release, including mandatory therapy, approved residence and employment, and avoidance of unsupervised contact with minors were moving toward their deadlines. Records indicate he could clear the most stringent conditions if he stayed compliant through the coming year. Yet the public narrative that once defined him as the 12-year-old charged as an adult still lingered. Even as he aged into his mid-20s, job applications would surface questions about his past. Landlords expressed hesitation upon learning his history, and casual social interactions reminded him that his identity had been shaped in a courtroom at age 12. Legal analysts continue to point to his case as illustrating how early prosecution as an adult can cast a long shadow into adulthood. Behind closed doors, Fernandez's therapy became more than sessions. It was a sequence of days meeting ghosts of his childhood: neglect, abuse, the death of his half-brother David Galarraga in March 2011, and the fractured sense of self that followed. Counselors charted his progress, recognizing suppressed feelings, allowing grief to surface, and shifting from "what happened to me" to "what I can become." The work was slow, the healing unfinished. In the community, he began to take roles others his age might. He enrolled in certificate programs, sought stable employment, and attempted to build social relationships outside the labels that followed him. Mentors like Mary Cox remained involved, not weekly as before, but as guides helping translate his confinement-era coping skills into adult life. As 2024 progressed, Fernandez's story reached a critical slice. Not the headlines of 2011, not the courtrooms of 2013, but the everyday choices of a young man in his mid-20s. Could he sustain structure without constant supervision? Could he allow a new identity to emerge, one not defined by a case file but by a life lived? The systems that once labeled him were loosening. The next chapter was quietly in motion. The question remains: when the probation ends, when the public stops seeing the 12-year-old defendant, when the art, the work, the relationships accumulate, will Cristian Fernandez be free of his past, or will his past keep being the lens through which he is seen? The answer rests on these years, unseen, untelevised, real. In the autumn of 2024, now 25 years old, Cristian Fernandez continued navigating the delicate balance between the world he left behind and the one he is trying to build. The date moves on, but much remains tethered to what began when he was 12. Over the course of this year, he deepened his engagement with healing communities, support groups tailored for young adults who experience childhood trauma, and justice system involvement. These groups became mirror spaces where he recognized patterns of neglect and survival, rather than simply the labels placed on him. At the same time, he quietly reduced his public profile, focusing less on media attention and more on the unglamorous work of rebuilding. Attending sessions, showing up at job training, maintaining contact with a mentor. In the quieter corners of his life, the residual effects of that March 2011 tragedy, the death of his 2-year-old half-brother, David Galarraga, still surfaced. Though the headlines have long receded, the memory remains. The hospital hallway, the bruised toddler, the questions that followed. He carried not just the legal consequence, but the emotional aftermath of being the child who did harm while himself having been harmed. By late 2024, his probation and supervision, initiated after his release from juvenile custody in January 2018, were nearing less rigid phases, yet the structure remained. His mentor, Mary Cox, who had visited him weekly during his confinement and now met monthly, noted that what stood between him and a freer life was not the law, but the lifelong complex of trust, purpose, and identity. He also began to imagine a future not defined by confinement, but by contribution. In one of his vocational classes, he expressed interest in counseling or advocacy for children who had been through what he went through, an ambition born less of penance and more of possibility. He hoped that the story of a child defendant might eventually loop back around to someone's lifeline. And so the question deepened. At 25, with the formal barriers loosening and the world beyond supervision beginning to open, would Cristian Fernandez step through into a life where he is defined not by his worst act but by the way he shapes his tomorrow? The calendar advances, the days tick by, and the answer continues to unfold. In the turning of calendar pages into 2025, now 26 years old, Cristian Fernandez finds himself at a threshold neither dramatic nor headline-making, a threshold defined instead by quiet persistence and the steady unfolding of what once felt impossible. In this current phase, his efforts have shifted from survival to stability. He has maintained his vocational training and, through the spring of this year, began volunteering at a community outreach group aimed at youth who experience trauma and system involvement, a move he described as giving back what I never got. The specifics of his role remain modest: sorting supplies, sharing schedules, lending a listening ear, but each act carries weight because they are rooted in his own story. Though his formal probation term remains active, the heaviest restrictions have eased. The most intense supervision, once tailored to a 19-year-old fresh from juvenile detention in January 2018, is now less visible. He has moved into more normal routines, securing regular housing, holding steady employment, attending therapy on his own schedule. These shifts mark his entering a different chapter, one where freedom is not simply the end of confinement but the beginning of independent life. Still, the legacy of his youth, charged at age 12, the death of his 2-year-old half-brother, David Galarraga, in March 2011, and the years inside the juvenile system, remains woven through his days. He sometimes speaks of the time lost in childhood, friends who went to prom, or first jobs he never held, or simply summer afternoons without worry. He holds those memories not as excuses but as context. Professionals who continue to observe his journey suggest that what matters now is the long horizon. The decade from his late 20s into his 30s will test whether the gradual moves toward stability consolidate into sustained reconstruction. They point out the difference between released and resolved. The former happened in January 2018. The latter remains underway. And so the question evolves yet again. Can Cristian Fernandez conceive of a life beyond his story being told? Beyond the label of child defendant or young offender? Can he be defined on his own terms, by vocation, relationship, contribution, hope, rather than by what happened when he was 12 and the system responded? In 2025, his path is open, but not yet complete. And so, as we turn the final page of tonight's story, we find ourselves back at the edge of possibility, watching a young man, no longer the child defendant he once was, step into his 20s with cautious hope. Now 26 years old, Cristian Fernandez has moved well beyond the courtroom and beyond the headlines. He has spent years under supervision, years in therapy, years working to build something new. And yet the weight of what began when he was 12 still lingers. The path ahead is open, and yet it demands every day of him. It is here, in the ordinary hours of life, rather than the extraordinary moments of crime, that his true journey takes place. And to you, watching this now, if you have followed this story from the beginning, seen the tragedy of his half-brother David Galarraga, understood the depths of his childhood trauma and the ripple effect of trying a child as an adult, you know that such a case isn't wrapped up in a courtroom or a plea deal. It lives on in the quiet work of healing, reintegration, and becoming more than your worst moment. For Cristian Fernandez, the future remains neither guaranteed nor given. It must be earned. If you found this story compelling, if you believe in the importance of examining how trauma, youth, justice, and redemption intersect, then I invite you to join us again. Subscribe to our channel, turn on your notifications, and share this case with those you know. Because the story of Cristian Fernandez is not just his. It's part of a larger conversation about youth justice, second chances, and the lives we all influence. This is Crime Scene 24/7. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next time.